Hello everybody and welcome back to my master class, the series where I work my way up the chess ladder and introduce concepts along the way. I'm not sure how long I'll be continuing this series. I'm really clawing my way up to get any of these matches. And in this match, you're going to see my opponent open very aggressively. If you go back to the top here, it says, that was a serious game. Intense. So he starts out with the e4 opening. I decide to go with the Sicilian defense. Apparently I've only played it 11 times. Comes in with his queen. I develop my knight. And these first two moves I actually saw in a Daniel Naroditsky video where he is coaching a streamer named Charlie for PogChamps.
Students around your level is bishop c4. Because again, people play the Italian against e5 and they don't sense the difference. The key difference here is that the e7 pawn has not moved to e5 yet. So what move becomes possible now? And this basically takes the entire point out of the move bishop c4, which is, of course, to pressure the pawn.
Oh, I can just move it up to e6 instead, right?
You can just move it up to e6, blunting the bishop and preparing potentially what move?
d5.
But right, potentially. You don't necessarily want to rush with that move. The move is e6.
It's basically like live streamers who don't play chess get coached by grandmasters to compete against one another in some kind of live stream contest for a big reward. So this is a good opening that's kind of safe against the e4. And you're going to see in his third move, he goes for the scholar's mate. This guy says it creates a checkmate threat. I have a story about getting mated with a scholar's mate that I'm not going to get into today, or else I'll start crying. When they go for a mate like this right off the bat, you have to defend, but you should also try to develop pieces while you defend. Make a move that serves more than one function if you can. So I move my knight out to f6, and he pushes his pawn up, attacking my knight. And this is where you're going to see it's a very tricky game already. With my knight under attack, what do I want to do? Your first instinct might be to move the knight. If I move it here, or here, or here, he can just come in with his queen and checkmate me. If I move my knight here, or here, he can just take my knight with his queen, or his bishop if he wants. So no matter where I move my knight, I lose the game, essentially, so I know that's not the right move to make. In a situation like this where your piece is under attack and you have no spaces to move it to, the next thing you should look for is a way to attack one of his pieces of greater value. I end up moving my knight up to d4, attacking his queen, and attacking this pawn here. If he moves his queen to the wrong square, I can come in with my knight here, checking his king and winning his rook. So that's why I prefer this move. The engine right now, the depth is 18. I don't really know the depths, but basically it's looking too shallowly. It thinks I should win a pawn instead. I like the position that I end up with here. If I decided to go where the engine wants me to here, it does fork the queen and the bishop, but he could just move his queen to, say, c3, and he's safe. His pieces are protected. I don't have that juicy opportunity to fork his king and his rook, which you'll see a lot at lower ratings like this. If you're around 1200, 1300, 1900 especially, being able to trade your knight for a rook is a common way to give yourself the advantage early on, and then it's just a matter of holding on to that. So he ends up moving his queen to c3. It defends his pawn, and you'll see the coach guy say that it overlooks a better way to defend the unprotected pawn. The coach recommends he just moves his queen back to the starting position. I don't think the opponent wanted to do that, because if he did that, it's almost like he never moved his queen in the first place. So he makes that mistake instead. I decide to come in with my knight, attacking his queen, chasing his queen down. I'm hoping that he doesn't move his queen to d3, because if he does, his queen is still defending that pawn, and then it's also attacking my knight. He ends up just taking my pawn with his bishop. I don't know if he didn't realize that I can take his bishop with my king. Maybe he thought this is just checkmate. I can't move my king anywhere. I end up taking his bishop. He moves up with his queen, checking my king again. But it's really not a threat. It's a paper tiger, possibly. I don't know what a paper tiger is. I decide to defend this threat by moving my pawn up 2 spaces to d5. And when you do this, and he ends up next to your opponent's pawn, you give your opponent an opportunity to make a move called en passant, which I'll just show you. You'll see he moves his piece diagonally, taking the piece next to him. Typically, you can only take diagonally if his piece is on that diagonal square. But in cases where you move your piece up 2 spaces, you know, your first pawn move with that pawn, and he ends up next to your opponent's pawn, your opponent can en passant. And this is the only move in chess where the piece functions differently than you generally think it does. It's the only secret move in chess. And because of this, a lot of times players are going to do en passant when they can, whether it benefits them or not, especially lower rated players. I did calculate for this en passant, and I decided to come up with my bishop, attacking his queen. Now his queen is attacked again, and it's put in a position where it still has to defend that pawn because I still have this knight on d4. This is why I really like moving my knight to d4, protected by my pawn, instead of having him on e5. He moves his queen to the right square, it's d3. At d3, he still defends his pawn, and he attacks my knight. The engine recommends my next move for me to move my bishop to f5. And that kind of attacks his queen through an x-ray. If I move my knight away to, say, take a pawn, the bishop could then take his queen. Instead, I just decided to take his pawn with my knight. You know, he wasted 3 turns moving that pawn. His pawn is already up at the 6th rank. It's getting dangerously close to queening. He's less of a liability than if I was to develop my bishop, defending him instead. Now he decides to develop his knight. It's important to develop your pieces when you're down material. In the last video I mentioned, if you're down material, instead of trading more pieces off the board, you want to keep as many of your pieces on the board, because those are the pieces that will give you opportunities to checkmate still. Even if you're down material and the engine says you have no chance, you still have plenty of chances for tricks. So developing a piece is the right idea, but you shouldn't have put it in a spot where I could just trade with my knight. I decided instead of taking this knight trade to push my bishop up to f5 now. Now that bishop is targeting that pawn, my knight is targeting that pawn, and he has to move his queen. Moves his queen to c3. It's still not enough to defend his rook. Come in with my knight, forking the king and the rook. He's in check. He has to move his king or take my knight. Moves his king closer. I take his rook. At this point, the game is mine. He develops his knight, defends this square here where I can move my knight to. Now my knight's kind of stuck in the corner. I don't mind that much. I decided to just move my bishop. He comes in with his knight, checking me. Move my king to e1. I like my king more on e1 than g1 because it gives that g1 square to my rook, so I can move my rook there in the future if I want to. Moves his queen over to f3. He's threatening to come in with his queen here. I push my pawn up. He takes my pawn with his knight. Take his knight with my pawn. He takes my rook with his queen. In the future, maybe he moves that pawn up, takes my knight with his queen. He can do some tricky stuff moving his queen to h5. So I respond by moving my bishop up to f5. Now if he does move his queen here, I'm in check. I have to move up with my pawn because his knight is attacking this square too. Can't move my king there. Move my pawn up. He comes in with his knight. At this point, I can use my bishop to take his knight. And then the bishop would be attacking his queen. So I liked having my bishop on this square to defuse this attack, his queen to h5. Decides to develop his rook to the open file. I just push my pawn up to defend my bishop. Open this diagonal for my other bishop. His queen comes in, taking my pawn. At this point, I didn't see the right move. The right move is clearly to take his queen with my knight. I was looking at weird moves with my queen and my rook, trying to trade queens, and I couldn't find the proper move. So I decided to just focus on the left side of the board. Push my pawn up 2 spaces. The game's going to call that a blunder. It says this lets your opponent fork your pieces. Essentially, he can win my rook now. Moves his queen there, checking my king. I move my bishop back to protect. The only other way I could protect was with my queen, and I don't want to drop my queen. He could take with his knight. I take with my queen, and then he takes my rook. So that's the fork that I blundered by pushing my pawn up to h5. He checks my king. I move my bishop back to attack his queen, defend the checkmate. Instead of coming in and taking that bishop with his knight, he just moves his queen back, taking my pawn. I decide to develop my bishop. Takes my pawn with his knight. I didn't even see that move. Now he's threatening my rook with his knight. It was at this position I couldn't figure out the best next move. If he comes in with his rook, I can only defend with my queen. And then he can win my queen with his knight. I'm playing rapid chess here. It's 10 minutes each. So if you're low on time, you spent too long on one move, you can make a move like this. I just check his king. Now the ball is back in his court. I have more time to think about this position. He pushes his pawn up. Now he's no longer in check. But it's given me enough time to figure out the best move here. Decide to move my rook over to c8. Now he comes in with his rook, and the game's going to call it a blunder. But if you see what happens here, I can only take with my queen. Now he can take my queen out. He decides before taking my queen, if he does take my queen, I can just take his. And now I have 2 rooks, 2 knights, 2 bishops, and he only has 3 pieces. Instead, what he decides to do here is take my rook with his queen. Now I'm in check. Thank God I had my knight at d6. If my knight wasn't there, I might have lost the game. Take his queen with my knight. I guess I could have taken it with my bishop, and I should have, because my bishop is still under attack. I just didn't realize. Takes my queen with his knight. Now I only have 1 rook, and he can take my bishop. Then it's 2 pieces to 4 pieces. And somehow he doesn't notice that he can take my bishop. I guess we're both ignoring it this game. So I move my bishop out of danger to e6. It's also targeting his pawn up here. He moves his knight. I take his pawn. He checks me with his bishop. I move my king. Checks me with his knight, basically doing anything he can with the pieces he has left. At this point, it's busted for him. I'm just taking material, getting my pieces closer to his king, checking however I can, threatening whatever pieces I can to get off the board. Finally, he moves his king to a square where I can take his pawn with my bishop, and that's checkmate. I didn't even realize it was checkmate when I did it, but that's the way it goes.